I got this. I got this. I got this. I don't got this. I don't got this. Hello Internet, my name is Quinn and this is now Blondihacks. As you can see, my shop is essentially set up and functional now after the big move, but I had a lot of requests from folks for more video on the setup and how I'm laying things out and all the sort of finishing touches. Of course, no shop is ever done, we're always constantly iterating on it, but I'll show you where I'm at now and where I think I needed to get to start making real videos again. So let's go. First victim of the move I found is this ruler, which rusted quite badly at one end. Claims to be stainless steel. Agree to disagree. Second victim I found was unfortunately my float lock vise, which rusted here where the jaw was sitting. There must have been some moisture in there, and I regret that I neglected to oil this before I packed it. And the handle also flash rusted, but that's because I forgot to actually ever treat this after I made it. So both my fault, but those are both easily fixed. Since last we spoke, the electrician has been here, put in this snazzy new sub panel with tons of room for expansion. So I've got nice big 20 amp circuits for all of the machines. They put in outlets behind all the machines there, everywhere that I might need them, and they put in a nice outlet for the welder back there as well. So I'm all set electrically, and I've got plenty of room to expand later if I need to. So very happy about that. On to storage next. I don't have any shelves here like I did in the old shop, and I missed that storage. So I've got some cabinets here from Canadian Tire, which is a Canadian big box store. And they have these very inexpensive upper garage cabinets that are actually quite nice. There is a lot of assembly required, let's just say. There's a lot of fiddly little pieces. It's all nicely stamped and powder coated sheet metal with riv nuts, and seems actually quite well made for the price. The kit comes with meticulously detailed instructions, which I will carefully store in the circular file. I'm just kidding. I'm actually a big believer in reading instructions, and I will take very good care of these, and I take back everything I said. Assembly is not difficult. It's a bit fiddly because there's a lot of little machine screws, but as I said, it all screws together with riv nuts, which is really nice because it means you can modify things or take it apart, put it back together again as much as you want. You'd expect crappy self-tapping sheet metal screws in a kit like this, so machine screws and riv nuts is nice. The mounting system for these is kind of like a French cleat. It just hangs on these wall brackets here. Unfortunately, it's two brackets instead of one big one, which means they have to be perfectly aligned with each other, which is kind of annoying. The kit supplies this 1-to-1 scale drilling template, which seems like a good idea, but is just honestly more trouble than it's worth. It's so folded and messed up and fussy. So I just did it all with measuring. This garage is drywalled, so I'm going to need to find studs. I have a stud finder, but it disappeared in the move, so I guess I need a stud finder. In lieu of that, I'm using a trick I learned from Bob Vila, which is to use a strong magnet to find the drywall screws. And that's going to be a very high likelihood of a stud being there. And you can also measure from a corner to try and confirm that. And, you know, when in doubt, you can always just start drilling tiny holes as well. I always drill a tiny hole to start anyway and make sure that there's resistance on the drill all the way down and that there's sawdust on the end of that drill. And there is, so this does appear to be a stud. And then once you've got one, you can generally measure to find the rest. But again, they aren't always perfectly spaced, so sometimes it still takes multiple tries. With a couple screws in the first bracket there, I thought I'd try hanging the cabinet now and just make sure that it's at the correct height. Obviously, with only 2 screws and one of the brackets installed, you can't put any weight on it, but I just want to verify that I can reach the back of the cabinet comfortably from the ground, reaching over the lathe, and that works out well. So happy with that, and now I can commit to this position. With the first bracket installed, the hard part then is getting the second one perfectly aligned with the first, which is, again, kind of the worst part of this kit, I would have to say. But some careful measuring and judicious use of a level and a square to get it parallel and well aligned with the bracket below, and this actually seemed to work okay. At least for the second one, you don't have to find the studs because you already know where they are from the first one. After all that fussing to get the brackets in the perfect positions, you would think hanging the cabinet would be the easy part. But no, this was actually very, very difficult. It took me a lot of tries to get this thing up there. it's awkward and I'm reaching over the lathe and you can't really see what you're doing and the door is in the way, and it took a lot of tries. And yes, you will fork up the drywall doing this. There's no avoiding that. But after many, many tries, I finally figured out the trick to doing this, which is to mark the wall with blue tape where the bottom of the cabinet is going to land. And that gives you a spot to aim on the French cleats to make sure that you get the clips just above where they're supposed to be. And you can push down with confidence knowing that you're on those brackets. So once I figured that out, it went a lot easier. On the second cabinet, I also figured out to install the door after you hang it. That's much easier, but not what the instructions say to do. A really nice feature of these cabinets, and part of why I chose them, is that the hinges are tension adjustable. So I can set them to where the lid will stay wherever I put it, and I won't have to reach up really high to close the lid again like you would with a gas shock style overhead door. I really like that a lot. The nice thing about doing multiples of something is that you hopefully make all the mistakes on the first one. So the second and third of these cabinets went much, much quicker. I found the studs and got the brackets installed pretty quickly and got this cabinet hung on the first try. You can see all the magnets there on the wall where I was finding all the drywall screws. That really is a good tip. It works 90% of the time, except when sometimes the drywall is screwed into a cross brace or a diagonal stringer or something, and then you're going to be in trouble. But for the most part, that trick works. In this regard, I do miss my old shop, which was open studs and plywood sheeting. It was trivial to hang things wherever you wanted, but building code here requires drywall in garages for fire safety, and it also means that the garage is insulated and vapor barriered, which is really nice for comfort in here. To start with, I went with 3 of those cabinets. As you can see, I resisted the urge to put one over the mill because I may actually want to put a larger mill in there someday, and it's very tight there on clearance already with this small mill. I haven't shown it yet, but over on the other side of the garage, I also have my material rack that you may have seen me build in an earlier video set up here. It fits reasonably well in that space. It's a little tighter than the old shop, but it does fit. Those all packed and unpacked really, really well. Next, because I'm a glutton for punishment, I thought I'd take a half-baked swipe at refinishing my workbench. New shop, new workbench, right? Unfortunately, most of the damage here was quite a bit deeper than 80 grit sandpaper was going to reach, but it did freshen up pretty nicely. Here's a trick so you don't have to buy those expensive special purpose sanding pads for these sanders. Just get out the spray glue and cut some regular 80 grit or whatever to fit the shape and spray glue it onto the worn out expensive pad that they make you buy, and Bob's your uncle. Really, you're just paying for the Velcro on the back of that pad, so there's no need to keep paying for it over and over. And then when that one wears out, you can either spray glue another one on top of it, or you can peel it off. And it works great. I haven't bought those pads in years. After that, I did a 240 grit pass and then cleaned it all up nice and thoroughly, and then I hit it with some of this triple thick polyurethane. Single coat seems to suffice with this stuff. It's really good stuff. As you can see, I didn't get most of the damage off the surface. I think it would have to go through a planer or one of those big giant drum sanders or something to really make this like new, but that's okay. It's definitely freshened up a bit, if you will. And there was no getting that big burn mark out. That thing is deep, so we're all still living with that one for a few more years. On to the machine tools now. I'm going to start by aligning the lathe because of course it's been moved, so you have to realign it anytime you do that. I've got my Machinist Level here, which if you don't know, these levels are self-proving. You find a level spot on your surface plate. There will be some axis on your plate that is perfectly level. And then once you've found that, you set up a straight edge so you can repeat this orientation, and then you flip it 180 degrees. Check it again. If it doesn't read the same value, then you adjust the thumb screw on the end until it does, and then the level is self-proved, and now it can be used to level the machine. Of course, we're using level as a proxy for twist here in the bed, so I measure at one end of the bed and measure at the other, and if needed, shim until this reads level, which it does. I did a whole video on this process here. I'm just skimming over it very quickly, so go ahead and check out how to align a lathe in my videos linked below if you'd like to get all the details here. Once it's in the ballpark by the Machinist Level, then it's time to do a test bar to really get it dialed in. This is done by taking a reasonably thick piece of steel round bar and facing at the end, putting a center in it so that we can turn a barbell shape out of it. You want to create 2 journals, one at each end, that are far enough apart that the work can be reasonably self-supporting when taking light cuts, and the further apart the better. And the idea is we take light cuts at each end and measure the size of the two journals. We don't want to cut the entire length of the bar because A, that just takes longer, and B, the bar would heat up and the tool would wear in between cuts. So we want the same cutting conditions at both ends of the part. We take very, very light cuts until the Sharpie mark is completely gone from both ends, and then we can take our first measurement. And we measure the size of each of these journals, and if one end is larger than the other, then we know that the bed has twist in it because the tool is closer to the part at one end than the other. In my case, the tailstock end was small, so the mental gymnastics tell me that the bed is twisted thusly, so I need to lift the rear of the tailstock foot there slightly. To do this, I unbolt the tailstock and then get the pry bar in there and pry up on the rear of the foot there, just enough to slide a shim in there. I typically start with an 8 or 10 thou shim and then take another cut, and you can close in on it from there using what a software engineer would recognize as a binary search. After each shim adjustment, you have to bolt the lathe all the way back down again, torqued good and tight, and then take more cuts, again using the Sharpie mark to make sure you've got a clear cut, and taking very, very light cuts at each end, measuring, rinse, repeat, etc. Here's the progression that I went through. I started with the tailstock end being 7/10 small, then I had a misfire there where the cross slide moved between cuts. Then I put an 8 thou shim in, and I ended up 7 thou large on the tailstock, so that's easy. I went half of that. I went to a 4 thou shim, and then I was 2/10 large on the tailstock. With only a 2/10 error now, I tried a small change, just moving the shim further back to lower the cosine angle of the foot there, but that made no difference. So then I went down to a 3 thou shim, and then I landed right on at both ends. So that's 0/10 of difference over 4 inches, so I'm happy with that. With the bed nice and straight, now we can align the tailstock. To do that, I pull my bar out and I convert it into a tailstock alignment bar. I cut another journal at the other end there, keeping the barbell shape in between. And now I'm turning between centers, which of course is necessary for moving the tailstock. And again, I take very light cuts until there's no blue left on both journals. Now I can start taking measurements. And from here on, it's the same process. I'm just measuring each end very carefully with a 10th micrometer and checking the difference between the two ends. This time my tailstock end is too large, so I need to move the tailstock a little bit closer to the tool, as you see me doing here. I start by moving half of the error shown on the tailstock alignment bar, but note that it's not going to be 1-to-1 because we're talking about angles here. There's going to be a cosine error, so you kind of move it back and forth a little at a time until you close in on the error. Once again, here's my progression. I went from being 5/10 large at the tailstock end to 6/10 small, so again I moved roughly 100% too far, so I went back half of that distance and I ended up 1/10 small at the tailstock end. And 1/10 over about 8 inches is excellent, so I'm not going to make myself crazy chasing that last tenth. Once again, I've sped through the process here, but go and check out my video on how to align your lathe for all of the devilish details in this process. On to the mill now, which is much simpler. These things really don't need a lot of care and feeding after being moved. I'll just clean up all of the excess shipping oil that I put on it, make sure all the slides move freely and so on. And then of course we need to remove the vise, get the table cleaned up, and it's time to trim the head. For this I have my very simple tramming tool that is literally some pieces of scrap metal Loctited together. I think because tramming is such a crucial high precision operation that people think the tool that does it must also necessarily be fancy or expensive, and it really doesn't. It also does not have to be rigid because the amount of droop in the arm is the same on both sides, so it cancels out. I fit this with my tenths indicator. Now I will say if you're doing this for the first time on a mill or you're relatively new at this, use a half thou indicator instead. Doing this with the tenths indicator will make you a little crazy. In my case, the tram was so far out that it actually was outside the range of this indicator, which is honestly not surprising considering that I've now lifted this mill twice and you lift the mill from the head, so it's very likely that you're really going to bork up the tram doing that. No big deal, we just loosen the bolts here, and when it's this far out, I just muscle it around by hand to get it into range, and then I bring in the tappy tap tap hammer and start fine-tuning it. And this is very simple. You just tap the low side of the head to rotate that side upwards and split the difference on the error until you get the same reading on both sides, and tighten up the head and then make sure the reading didn't move. And now I've got about 2.5 tenths of difference over almost the entire length of the table. Very excited with that result. Metric horns of victory. Once again, I've glossed over the details there of tramming the head, so check out my Mill Skills playlist for all the gory deets. And now back we go on with the vise, and I'm using the power feed one-shot method, which involves power feeding and tapping on the low side of the vise until the needle stops moving, ignoring the numbers, looking only at the movement of the needle. And as you can see there, in one pass, I've got it dialed into within 1/10 over 4 inches. That's by far the easiest technique I've found for indicating the vise. And contact. Well, DRO survived the move, and it's drawing, I guess. I don't know, numbers are changing. Seems fine. We'll engage OCD mode. Perfect. I had a lot of folks ask me to go over the layout of the shop and why I'm placing things where I am and so on. So this setup, of course, you will recognize from Blondihacks 1.0. It's exactly the same. I've got my big L-shaped steel bench with the lathe and the mill on it. And as you can see here, one of the reasons I like benchtop machines so much is that you get a ton of storage underneath. So, these are all of my big machine tool parts, the extra chucks and the rotary tables and so on are all in these big bins here. And then this cabinet here has basically all of my tooling in it for the lathe and the mill. And it's super handy to both machines, super efficient. So this setup from the old shop has worked really, really well for me. And so I really wanted to keep this. The biggest change and improvement from the old shop is this area back here. So I'm past the end of my workbenches and tool cabinets here. You can see I've got an empty space here that's going to be for the portable bandsaw that's going to get mounted on the wall. I've got all the bracketry and stuff there for that. And then of course the drill press is going to live roughly there. Then here in the corner we've got the welder, and I had the electrician put in an outlet for the welder right there. And then there's going to be a welding bench back here. And it's going to be blocking this roll-up door here, which I don't need, of course, but the bench will also be on wheels so I can roll it out of the way if I do need to use that roll-up door for anything. And then at this end of the welding bench, I'll have my bench grinder permanently mounted there, and I'm also going to have a hearth, so I've got my torch sitting there waiting. Need new tanks for that, but the torch is going to live down here, and that's going to be where I do my silver soldering, heat treating, and so on. Sorry, silver soldering, heat treating, and so on. So this is kind of like the dirty end of the shop. All of the grinding, welding, etc. is at the far end away from the machine tools. And in fact, I could even put up a curtain here if I needed to, but the big win here is that all the tools I just listed, from the bandsaw, drill press, welder, all the way around to the horizontal bandsaw, this is all stuff that in my old shop I had to take out of storage essentially to use every single time. And that was a huge pain in the patootie, and so it's going to be really awesome to have all these machines permanently set up like this so I can just walk over and use them, and for your benefit, walk over and film at them. In a lot of my videos, I would gloss over, oh, I went and cut this on the bandsaw, and not actually show you the action because, well, frankly, it was such a pain to set up the bandsaw, set up the lights, and get the camera over there and so on to film. So this is going to be a lot easier now. And once again, in reverse angle, so here you can see the main workshop area with all the benches and the tool cabinets, and then the bandsaw will be just at a frame on the left here, and once again, the giant pile of rubbish won't be there. A visible change from the old shop is also these overhead cabinets, which you saw me install. In my old shop, I had heavy-duty shelving that was put in by the previous owner, and that was really great. I love having storage above the machine tools and above the workbenches. And so I had to kind of recreate that here with these overhead garage cabinets, which is not something you see a lot of people do. And I think they're undervalued, because not only do you get storage that's up out of the way and makes use of otherwise wasted vertical space, but you also get additional surfaces. So you get a storage surface on top there, and you get a storage surface underneath there where you can hang things or mount lights or do all sorts of other, organization and storage type things underneath there. Okay, but it's not a Blondihacks shop until there's a half-finished steam engine on the bench, so let's correct that situation. Here's the big beast that I've been working on. It seemed well packed, nothing seems to have been damaged. Let's see if it survived its 2,500 kilometer journey. And indeed it did. Look at that. It seemed to be using a lot of air until I realized that, oh yeah, I'd pulled the blanking plugs out of the drain cocks on it, so there was air flooding out of there. But once I plugged those, then it was running like a champ, just like I remember. So that's great news. The engine seems to have survived. It was packed well, and I'd marked it fragile, and the movers were really very good about this sort of thing. So no trouble there. That's good news. Wait. One more thing. There. Now it's the Blondihacks shop once again. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little unpacking and setup video. We'll be back to regular traditional Blondihacks content if you like very, very soon. Thanks for your support, patrons, for helping me through this big move. And thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.